In this lecture, we will be looking at Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. First, we'll begin with Impressionism. Impressionism centered in France, and what the Impressionists sought to do was this was a new way of expressing reality. They were, I don't want to say in competition with the camera, but they wanted to show reality in a way that was different from the camera. What they sought to do was capture the psychological perception of reality through color and motion. What happens in this, the Impressionists were actually a small, close knit group of individuals who would work together and who would also often show their works together. The subject matter of the Impressionists are usually the everyday. However, it's not quite the everyday as we saw with the realism, or especially the social realism. Usually, the everyday individuals were the middle classes or the working classes, and the happy working classes, middle classes, if you will. Interestingly enough, the Impressionists usually painted in a manner that was opposite from other styles. Usually, when you begin a painting, you treat the canvas and then you paint the entire work a dark color and then add lighter colors. Well, what the Impressionists would do is they would actually paint the canvas white and then build up to dark colors. Impressionists have a profoundly different vision of the world, and they had a new way of rendering this vision onto canvas. The paintings are usually small, they're often of outdoor scenes, and this actually included painting in the open air and not a studio. This was something that was relatively new at the time. Usually, artists would have studies and have models, and they would paint in studios. Many of the Impressionists actually painted out in nature. The composition is open, it's casual, it's very natural. And again, with this idea of capturing a fleeting moment, is that they wanted to show the natural effects of light on subject matter. And so that's why you're going to see many, many paintings by the same artist of the same subject matter, yet just at different times of day and even different times of year. As I mentioned in class, the painting that you see here is one of Monet's wheat stacks, but it's actually a different version than the one in your textbook to again show this idea of the same scene but different times of day, different light, and it gives the work almost an entirely different meaning. Interestingly enough, Impressionism is usually in museums and such one of the most sought after artistic styles, but this was actually a very short lived movement. At its height, it only lasted about 15 years. And interestingly enough, the Impressionists took their name. It was originally meant as an insult, and it's from this painting here. This is Claude Monet, 1840 to 1926. This is his painting Impressionism Sunrise, 1872. It is an oil on canvas. And what happened is there was a critic, Louis Leroy, and what he said about this painting, he's like, it's not even a sunrise, it's just an impression of one. And the Impressionists were like, actually, yes, that's exactly what we were trying to do with this. And so they took that insult and they actually turned it into the name of their artistic style. Claude Monet is considered the founder of French Impressionism, and he was very, very fascinated with the natural effects of light on subject matter. And so he again would paint the same subject matter different times a day, different times a year. Probably most famous or most well known of these paintings are his water lilies, which you see an example of here. And I've actually included a short YouTube clip. You can go and watch this. And this will show you some of the water lilies from the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. We can see here the very loose brush strokes. It looks as if the painting was done very quickly and very freely, but these works are usually very carefully composed. They aren't just quick little sketches, but again, they're trying to capture the impression of a moment. We can see this continued on with the works of Pierre-Auguste Renoir, 1841 to 1919. Renoir again was looking at the ordinary life, but not like social realism is. What he would focus on was what was considered the good life of the middle class. And we see that clearly in the work here. This is Dance at La Moulin de la Guette, 1876, and it is also an oil on canvas. And what Renoir would do was he specialized in the human form, and he wanted to show what was beautiful about the body, and that's usually what he highlighted. And he would do this in both his paintings and in sculpture. In his works, you again see this casualness, this open composition that almost tends to invite the viewer in. And what we see here is we see in a Paris scene. It's an outdoor restaurant and a dance hall. And this almost appears like it would be a snapshot, that most of the people in the painting don't appear aware that the painter is there, except for the couple dancing on the right-hand side. Interesting enough, these two people were staged in this. They were friends of Renoir. The model is Margot, which was a model that he typically used in paintings. And then the man on the left is Solaris, which was a well-known Cuban painter of the time. But here again, look at the use of light within this. We're looking at an outdoor scene, and it almost seems to be speckled in places. But what we're seeing is we're seeing the natural use of the light as it shines down onto these individuals through the trees. Again, the brush strokes not clearly as free as in the Monet works, but you can see here we don't have any hard outlines. Lines appear much softer. And what's very interesting is the use of color. We don't really have any solid blacks in this, but we see mixes of blues and browns in that to create the feel of the work. Next, we're going to move on to Berthe Morisot, 1841 to 1895. Interestingly about her, she is a female artist. The Impressionists were open and accepting to having female artists in their fold. Interesting fact, she's actually married to Manet's younger brother, Manets. We saw him with realism. His younger brother, Eugene. So she was already part of this art family. Her works are usually more introspective, and they often focus on the family, especially women and children. You can see in her works very loose brushstrokes. You can see the short, rapid movements, and at times the figures almost seem to lose their form. In the painting that we see here, this is Summer's Day from 1879, and it's an oil on canvas. On the right-hand side in the water, there's actually 3 ducks in the water, but if you get closer to them, their forms almost seem to go away. It was mentioned in class. The woman on the left, somebody said they felt like she almost got tired of painting it because the bottom of the dress almost seems to be kind of these scribbled, painted in little zigzags. And again, that's that loose style of the Impressionists. Now, this is another painting by Morisot. This is called In the Dining Room, 1886, and it's an oil on canvas. Again, we see these very quick brush strokes, the very loose, open composition. In the work, we have lots of things going on, but not a lot of details. Our emphasis is on the serving girl, and that's who this is. She would be a servant. However, servants usually something that were overlooked or meant to be discarded. She is looking right back at the viewer, which gives her a sense of agency, that she is to be looked at not just as a serving girl, but as a person. And that's what's very important about the work here. Again, interestingly enough, we do still see a dog in the picture. If we look in the lower right-hand corner, you see the white small dog. And again, we talked about dogs usually representing loyalty and fidelity. And usually we've seen those in relation to romantic relationships. Here we see a woman on her own. So perhaps she's loyal to her, who she works for, or maybe Morisot is making a statement here that she's only loyal to herself and not beholden to anybody else. Well, next we're going to see a little bit of a shift in the Impressionists, and we're going to see this with Edvard Degas. 1834 to 1917. Degas was not a well-liked individual. He was actually independently wealthy, and he could paint whatever and however he wanted. He was not well-liked by the other painters because he was snobby, he was very unfriendly, and he was very sarcastic with his wit. And interesting enough, Degas believed that art should not be available to the lower classes. He did not think that they had the education or the culture to fully understand or appreciate them. Degas is a little bit different from the other Impressionists. He did not want to be considered an Impressionist. Remember, the Impressionists usually open composition, painted outside on the moment, not in a studio. Well, Degas was completely the opposite of that. And he's been called what we will consider a linear Impressionist. So his works were actually well thought out, and he often made many, many sketches. In fact, he hated the word Impressionism and he did not want to be seen as one. However, his works give you almost that same sense of spontaneity. You see loose brushstrokes, the choice and treatment of the subject matter. Again, he would usually look at the everyday middle class individual. And we can see that in his class, in his work here, the dancing class from 1874, again in oil on canvas. Here, even though it has a little more form than some of the other paintings, we still see that loose brushstroke, that sense of fluidity and movement throughout the work, and that is why Degas is usually classified with the Impressionists, even though that is something that would make him very unhappy. Moving on, we have another female painter. This is Mary Cassatt, 1844 to 1925. She was an American, however, she was an expatriate, meaning she was from Pittsburgh, but she then moved and lived the rest of her life in Europe. She was often called a mad woman because of her style, that she would have very different juxtapositions and angles within her work. And you can see that here in The Boating Party, 1893 to 94. This is an oil on canvas. And what we see with this one, first off, we look at our subject matter. We have what appears to be a small family, a mother, a father, and the small child. The father's back is almost completely to us. We can only see a little bit of his face and profile. And the clear center of the subject matter is the woman holding the child. If you follow the man's arm and the oar, it points right to her. The sail almost creates a triangle that points right to her. Interestingly enough, the child itself seems to be squirming on the lap, definitely does not want to be there. In her work, she would usually have asymmetrical composition. We still see these open, loose brushstrokes, especially in the water in the back. But what Cassatt would do was a little different, was she would have these large, flat color areas. So if you look at this painting, the two main colors are yellow, that very bright bold yellow, and that bright blue. And they seem to juxtapose each other and grab the attention. Also, this has a very unusual perspective. We are actually standing on the edge of the boat looking down into it. But we can tell that because we can see all the way to the floorboards of the boat. And then what's also interesting about the composition is it seems to just abruptly cut off. This work, we're also going to see what we call the flattening of the canvas, meaning Cassatt was not very worried about the three-dimensionality of her work. And so we're going to start seeing works become more two-dimensional, and that's how these works are almost transitioning into post-impressionism. And this next work, more so than any of the others. This is by James Abbott McNeill Whistler, 1834 to 1903, also an American expatriate. Now, your textbook has him in with the Impressionists. However, Whistler followed aestheticism. Aestheticism was an artistic movement that was considered art for art's sake only. That art did not have to do anything else but to be beautiful. It did not need to convey any sort of message or have any moralistic ideals behind it. And that's actually what Whistler followed. Here you're looking at probably his most famous work. This is titled Arrangement in Black and Gray, The Artist's Mother, most commonly known as Whistler's Mother, 1871, oil on canvas. And what Whistler liked, he looked at his paintings He almost saw them more as musical arrangements than portraits. Here we're going to see space is flattened. There is very little depth in this. So we see again this flattening of the canvas. Light and shadow are all very minimal within the work. Now we're going to look at sculpture very briefly, and this is still Impressionistic sculpture. Probably most famous is Auguste Rodin, 1840 to 1971, and he was a French artist. And he was the most famous sculptor of his time period. He did use models for his work, but he liked them to walk around. So again, he could get that sense of movement and form in the motion. And we're going to see this impressionistic idea reflected within his works, especially in the work you see here. This is The Thinker, 1879 to 1889, and this is a bronze. This one is located in the Met in New York City. The original is located in the Muséum de Rodin in France. And here in in Kentucky, the University of Louisville, we actually have a copy of The Thinker on the campus of the University of Louisville that you can go and see. From the original sculpture, we had nine different ones that were cast from the mold. The one at the University of Louisville, interesting enough, was the first made after the original, and it was the only one made using the lost wax technique. And if you're interested in that technique, I've attached a YouTube video so you can see and understand the complexities of it. But however, in The Thinker, why we consider this impressionistic is because he uses texture and light to give the work dramatic qualities, to give it almost a sense of movement. Compare it to Michelangelo's David from the High Renaissance, the very smooth planes. Well, in this, The Thinker appears almost lumpy or bumpy within the work, and that's supposed to represent almost those same brushstrokes as the Impressionists. We can see this again in his sculpture, The Kiss, 1886 to 98. This is a marble. It's actually 6 feet 2 inches tall, and it's also in the Musée Rodin in Paris. And here we see a clear emphasis on the human form. This one not quite as lumpy, as you will, as The Thinker, but again, we still see these same impressionistic ideas. And then here we have another sculptor. This is Camille Claudel, 1864 to 1943. Again, another French artist and also a woman. Here she also focused on the human form. We're looking at her The Waltz from 1892, and this is a bronze. It's a smaller bronze. It's only 9, almost 10 inches. Originally, this was a nude couple dancing, but the public was very shocked by this, and so she added costumes to this version of the work. But again, here we see that impressionistic idea of capturing a moment. And here we're capturing a very intimate moment between a couple simply as they are waltzing together. Next, we're going to briefly look at music. Impressionist music was very anti-romantic, and they turned to the symbolist poets for inspiration. We can clearly see these ideas most easily in the works of Claude Debussy, 1862 to 1918, and he was French. Interesting enough, he also did not want to be called an impressionist, and he sought no association with any specific style. However, his works do seem to reflect the very same ideas. He rejected the dramatic dynamics of the classical and romantic composers, and instead he focused on natural scenes. And what he actually wanted to do in his work was to capture the effects of shimmering light within music. He wanted to return French music to sources in nature, and his idea was to give pleasure. Many of his works have Oriental influence, and the form and content are very second to expressive intent within the work. And you can see that and hear that very clearly in the work I have attached here. And this is called Clair de Lune, or Light of the Moon. Please take a moment and listen to this. It's only a couple minutes long. And think about the images he wanted to create with this song. He wanted to create music that was literally a reflection of the play of light. And then for literature, I actually want to focus on two authors that your textbook does not talk about. The first is James Joyce, who you see on the left, and Virginia Woolf on the right. They both wrote in what's called the stream of consciousness, and this is writing that reflects the human mind, and it tries to capture the fullness, the speed of the human mind. Often you're going to see interrupting thoughts and this free association. James Joyce, 1882 to 1941, was from Ireland. His most famous work is entitled Ulysses, and it was a modern-day parallel to Homer's Odysseus. What happens in this book, it's a very, very large text, but all of the action takes place within a single day in Dublin on June 16th in 1904. And he uses stream of consciousness. And again, what stream of consciousness is, it's writing as actually our brain works. Think about your brain when you just let it go and you're just maybe walking down the street and all the things that pass through your mind. Or as you're sitting in class, you're trying to comprehend what your professor's saying. You're thinking about how hungry you are, that you want to get a drink. Maybe later you're going to do this. Oh, the person in front of you is playing on Facebook. What are they doing? All of these different thoughts that just seem to pop into the mind. And that's how Joyce writes the work. Virginia Woolf would also do the same things. Her date's 1882 to 1941. She was an English author, and she would focus on moments of experience, usually dealing with very personal internal conflict. And she'd look at what she considered the discontinuity of experience. She turns away from very traditional characters and plots, and she would usually talk about women's positions. In fact, in a nonfiction work of hers, A Room of One's Own from 1929, she advocates for women's rights. And here I'm going to read you an example. This is from Mrs. Dalloway, and it gives you an idea of this stream of consciousness. This is a moment where the character in the book is just getting ready to cross a London street. Such fools we all are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street. For heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh. But the veriest frumps, the most dejected of miseries, sitting on doorsteps, drink their downfall, do the same. Can't be dealt with, she felt positive, by acts of parliament for that very reason. They love life. And people's eyes, and the swing, tramp, trudge, and the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwichmen shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, in the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some aeroplane overhead, was what she loved. Life. London. This moment of June. And again, this is from Mrs. Dalloway. And so you get that sense of the stream of consciousness, that it's just everything that goes into the mind. And so at times it can seem very cluttered and disorganized, yet it gives the reader an insight into the characters that's not otherwise available. Now next we're going to move to the Post-Impressionists. Now the Post-Impressionists were only actually going to look at painting. Post-Impressionism, first and foremost, developed from Impressionism. It's not a reaction to it, but it develops from it. So we're going to see some similarities. Some of these similarities include the subject matter. Post-impressionistic works are, again, going to focus on outdoors. The people that are portrayed are usually, again, the usual everyday citizen. However, what we're going to see in Post-Impressionism is that they try to offer more control, more form than the Impressionists do. You'll still see some of this loose brushstroke in some of the artists, but not all. Post-Impressionism is a very varied style. But again, what unifies them is this control over Impressionism. And you'll see this done in various ways. The painting you see here is from Vincent van Gogh. This is Landscape with Wheat Sheaves and Rising Moon, 1889, and it's an oil on canvas. Now this work is very reflective of some of the Impressionistic works. We see that quick, short little brush strokes. Yet here we see that flattening of the canvas, that two-dimensionality of the works. And we will see this in many of the Post-Impressionist paintings. Also in Impressionism, you would not see any outlines. Here we definitely see some clear outlines within the work. What happens in post-impressionism, you see more of this return to form and structure in painting. We're going to start seeing more clean color areas, very carefully applied color, and sometimes it's almost in a very scientific manner. Now the second artist we're going to look at is Paul Cézanne, 1839 to 1906, and he was a French artist. He is actually considered the father of modern art. And what he wanted to show in his works is he wanted to show order, stability, and permanence. And he believed how you did this was that you broke the forms down to its smallest available space. And he would call these little planes. Think of them almost as little boxes. Now, this idea is actually the precursor to Cubism that we'll see in the following lectures, because Cubists believe that objects in the space around them could be broken into little cubes. And so they get this idea from Cézanne. Cézanne's works here use geometric shapes and outlining, and the shapes show the underlying forms that he believed could be found in nature. So if we look at the painting here, Mount St. Victoria from the Large Pine Tree, 1887, oil on canvas, we're looking at a landscape, yet this is very different than other landscapes we've looked at before. Look at the rolling hills here. We can see almost little rectangles, little boxes, and that would be those planes that he breaks down everything down to. Cézanne would take liberties with color. Again, this is not meant to be a representational work. He's still trying to get almost that moment of it, but again, it's the moment as broken down to its original or base forms. He was also not worried about three-dimensionality in the work. This is a very flat canvas, and interesting enough, if we look at the tree, the large pine tree, it seems to start in the foreground, yet if you look at some of the branches, they almost seem to be part of the background. Now we can see some more of these ideas in this other painting of Cézanne's. This is Still Life with Peppermint Bottle, 1894, and it's an oil on canvas. Again, Cézanne is not worried about being photographic in the work, and here you definitely can see that flattening of the subject matter. This painting is much more two-dimensional than three-dimensional, and if you look closely, you can see where he breaks down these elements into their basic geometric forms. Now, the next Impressionist that we're going to look at, again, adds more form and structure, but he does it in a very different way. This is Georges Seurat, 1859 to 1891, also a French painter. Now, his works are almost created scientifically. The work you're looking at here is A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jatte, 1884 to 1886, and it's an oil on canvas. This is also a very large work. It is 6 feet 9 3/4 inches by 10 feet 1 1/4 inch. And what's happening here, the subject matter, again, ordinary people. Now again, these are the ordinary people of the middle class living the good life. They're just out in the park on a sunny Sunday afternoon. However, here you can see it's much more ordered. We're going to see very sharp silhouettes. And how Seurat created this work is what's called pointillism. And that is where you apply the paint one dot at a time from the tip of the brush. Here you can see, think of how large this painting was and how long it would have taken this to create this. When you get a closer look at this, this is not created with any solid color fields. So if we look at the dog here, he seems to be a darker brown or a black, but if you get closer to it, you see it's made up of these tiny little dots of very, very different colors. So to create this work, which from a distance seems to be solid color fields, once you go up closer to it, it becomes very impressive with how exact and scientific this work was. Or still is. It still exists. It's actually in Chicago. And here I've attached a YouTube clip. This painting actually has a role in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but the reason I put it in there is because they get closer and closer and closer to the painting, so you can see this blend of colors and these very, very small dots. Right, and then another post-impressionist that we're going to look at is Paul Gauguin, 1848 to 1903, also a French painter. However, he was actually a banker and a stockbroker in Paris, and he suffered a personal crisis at the age of 35. He then left his wife and his 5 children to become an artist. And what he wanted is he had this desire to escape what he called the everyday world. And he actually sailed to Tahiti in 1891, where he lived in a wood hut. He painted all day while naked. He called himself Monsieur Savage, meaning savage, and then he eventually married a Tahitian woman and had a son. Now, he's what's considered a symbolist, which he uses symbols to represent ideas, usually religious ideas, within his work. He insisted on form and realistic effects. However, when we look at these forms, we see they are very, very flattened, and you can see that in the work here. This is Mano Tapano. It's also called Spirit of the Dead Watching. 1892, oil on burlap mounted on canvas. And here he claims he painted the scene as he found it, that he returned to his hut one night and he found his wife frozen in bed from fear, from terror. And what she's afraid of, it's the woman in the background sitting, which is the spirit of the dead. And she's just sitting there watching her. And that's why she's frozen in fear. However, we also see the white splotches in the background. These are supposed to be photofluorescent fungi, meaning when certain light hits them, they tend to glow. And the people in this area actually believe those were spirits of ancestors sent there to protect you. So what he's trying to do within this work is, through the use of color, he's trying to convey fear and sadness. And he considered these colors very frightening. Here we see very heavy outlines and these flattened forms showing the control over the ideas of Impressionism. All right, finally we're going to look at Vincent van Gogh, 1853 to 1890. He was a Dutch painter. Here we can see his works. We definitely see some of the impressionistic idea, painted very quickly, usually with a very thick application of paint. Sometimes he would use brushes. Sometimes he would use a palette knife and just put large chunks, large pieces of paint on it. However, your textbook has him as a post-impressionist. We're going to discuss him more as an expressionist artist, which we'll actually talk about once we get to modern art. However, though, in this painting, Sunset Wheatfields near Aries, this was painted in June 1888. It's an oil on canvas. We can definitely see some of those impressionist ideals and the post-impressionist ideals. The flattening of the canvas, definitely more control, especially when we look at the city in the background. But for the bulk of our talk, we will discuss him as an expressionist artist. And then finally, we're going to very briefly look at the artistic style of the Art Nouveau. This came around about the 1890s, early 1900s. It was launched by Victor Herrada, who was a Belgian artist. And it actually grew out of the English arts and craft movement, and it was a response to industrialization, especially to the Eiffel Tower that opened in 1889 and which was designed by the French Gustave Eiffel. The Eiffel Tower stood at 984 feet, and at the time it was built was the tallest structure in the world. Many people considered it actually an eyesore, and they were worried about the industrial influence it would have on art. Well, Art Nouveau movement strove from this. It was a reaction to it. And what Art Nouveau wanted to do was it wanted to reflect modern ideas, but keep a pre-industrial sense of beauty. And how they would do this was showing a fascination with plant and animal lives, with organic forms, traditional materials such as wood and stone. The Art Nouveau had a strong Japanese influence with its curving lines, and we can see that clearly in the building here. This was constructed by Antoni Gaudí, 1852 to 1926. He was the architect. And what happens is he would often handcraft buildings with no set plan. Not a very popular idea. But here you're looking at the Casa Milà apartment building in Barcelona, Spain, 1905 to 07. Again, you see these Art Nouveau, the organic, naturalistic idea, Parts of this seems like it's almost molded out of clay, when in fact it is created out of cut stone. And you see very few flat areas or straight lines. And again, it's decorated with this plant and animal life to give it this sense of organic naturalness to it. That is a reaction to the industrialized world. And then that concludes this lecture of Post-Impressionism, Impressionism, and then very briefly the Art Nouveau.